So today I want to talk about a book that I just finished reading, and the title of the book is called John and Paul, A Love Story in Songs. So I think the title can kind of give you an understanding of the book. And the book is primarily about the relationship between the two, I would call them the two primary Beatles. Of course, those of us who know the story of the Beatles know that John really started the band. He was the original band leader. And I think the book makes clear that, throughout the career of the Beatles in the 1960s, John remained the primary leader, but kind of ceded some of his role to Paul over time. They had a complicated and very deep relationship. And everybody, I think, who knows the Beatles well, who has, like me, not only been steeped in their music over the years, but also, read books about the Beatles, Beatles biographies or individual biographies, or has watched the documentary films that have come out about the Beatles or some of the feature films. They know this already. They know that John and Paul had a deep relationship that was complicated. But this book, I think the great contribution of this book by Ian Leslie lies not so much in original primary research or uncovering documents or materials that hadn't been covered before. It's more about perspective. It's more about the synthesis that he offers the reader. So again, the focus is on the relationship between John and Paul. And I think you could say, he sees the relationship between John and Paul as the primary engine behind the creative process of the Beatles. And these two men were obviously close collaborators. They were songwriters who shared the credits for many of their songs, who wrote together. Most of their great songs were written together as a duo. That's a procedure that they established very early on in their relationship when they were teenagers. And that continued until late in the career of the Beatles, when they started to go their own individual ways. I would say, especially starting with the White Album around 1968. And then, as we all know, by 1969 they had broken up as a band, or in 1969 or early 1970, depending on how you look at it. They were over as a band. So that's the main trajectory of this story is, from the time that they met as boys, as teenagers, in the late 1950s, when they were living in the northern city or environs around Liverpool, and met as teens, connected by music. Basically, Paul joined John's skiffle band, all the way up until their breakup circa 1969-70, about the time that I was born into this world. And then, of course, the aftermath of that breakup in the 1970s until John's death in 1980. And then the book goes all the way, it takes you all the way to the present day, pretty much, where, Paul continues to remember his friend in different ways. So it's a beautiful story. It's kind of a sad story. I think you might find yourself in tears by the end of it. There's a lot of laughter and tears in this book. So there's a lot to be joyous about, but between their breakup and John's tragic death, which personally I've never been able to get over. I was maybe 10 years old when that happened, and it shook me to my core. And I've never gotten over that incident. And of course, for Paul, that was a horrific event in his life, and one that he never recovered from as well. I think anybody who loved the Beatles and loved John that's left a deep traumatic hole in their lives. But that's just the end point of the book. Most of the book is about their development as individuals and as a band, and how they collaborated with each other. And I would say at the heart of his thesis, if there is a thesis here, it's that there was a deep and abiding love that Paul and John had for each other that was very special and different to the relationship that they had with George and Ringo. They were very close with each other, and they ended up hurting each other when they inevitably broke up at the end of the 1960s. So that's kind of the arc of the story, which he likens, or certainly his, the interviewers, the interviews that he was able to gather to use as material for this book. There's a lot of consensus that their breakup, in particular John and Paul's breakup, not the band breakup, but John and Paul's breakup as collaborators is likened to a divorce. So their collaboration and their friendship has almost the profundity of a marriage, and in a lot of ways it did work in a kind of marital way, in terms of being a very, very close collaboration, friendship, and partnership, and economic interdependency. So I'll get back to that. I want to start by just reading from the end of the book. I think this really gets at the heart of his core message. He writes, "There are several reasons why we get Lennon and McCartney so wrong. But one is that we have trouble thinking about intimate male friendships. We're used to the idea of men being good friends or fierce competitors or sometimes both. We're used to the idea these days of homosexual love. We're thrown by a relationship that isn't sexual but is romantic. A friendship that may have an erotic or physical component to it but doesn't involve sex." And then he goes on to quote Plato, but I'll just kind of pass over that. And then he has a quote from, or not a quote, a quote from the French philosopher Montaigne, who also had a very close friendship with a male companion that wasn't sexual. So I think that's his point, is that they had a very deep, in some ways, erotic relationship with each other, certainly emotionally very, very deep, certainly intimate, very intimate friendship and collaboration with each other, and knew each other intimately. And yet, I think it's safe to say it wasn't a sexual relationship in the conventional way. Perhaps in the imagination, but it was probably just as deep, if not deeper. And that's what produced the magic of the Beatles, I think, is the corollary to that, is that it was this relationship between John and Paul, their deep friendship, deep companionship, their intimate contact with each other over the years that produced the best of what we know from the Beatles. Now, of course, you can make the counter argument, where's George? George was also a singer-songwriter. He was also a very important component to the band's sound. He eventually became a significant songwriter in his own right. Ringo, of course, as the supporting band member, keeping the beat and kind of keeping the friendships, balancing out the friendships and the rivalries between the other three Beatles. So we know something about that. But I think that, obviously, again, there's a lot we know about the Beatles if you've read and and consumed movies about them and listened to their music as I have. But I do feel that this opens up a new window into the story of the Beatles. It's definitely worth reading. It's a pretty thick book. Comes to, around 400 pages. It took me maybe a month or more of sporadic reading to get through it, chapter by chapter. The way that it's organized, I think, is pretty clever. It basically tells vignettes, kind of chapters of their lives and of their relationships through songs. So basically, every chapter is the title of a song that they either wrote together or sang together, or that one of them wrote for the other one in some cases. And that song it's not that the chapter is totally focused on that song. The chapter tells other stories and talks about other songs and maybe the album that they were working on at the time. But it provides an insight into that particular song and why it's important in their developing relationship. So again, the focus is on the relationship between Paul and John, and on the impact of that relationship on the music they made and vice versa. So it's basically a history of the Beatles. It covers, I would say, fairly comprehensively their story. Obviously, not every detail. There are other biographies that have far more details, but it does go chronologically through the career of the Beatles in the 1960s until their breakup. So I think it's a fun and clever way to construct the book. We get at least one key insight per chapter based on the song that he chose that tells us about the evolving relationship between the two primary Beatles. So what you're not going to get a lot of details about George and Ringo in this book. It's really focused on Paul and John. They're there in the background. They're there as supporting figures in the story, but the real focus is on John and Paul, all the dynamics of their relationship over time. And I think the other thing that, that quote I just read makes clear is that there was a kind of intimate love between the two. And when they were writing love songs, they weren't just to, women in their lives or their audience at large. They were writing to each other. I think that's kind of the genius of the key insight of this book, is that many of the songs, and I think he makes a convincing argument, that many of the songs that they wrote, you can interpret as being written for each other. And one thing that he mentions throughout the book that makes a lot of sense is that as they were going through their songwriting process, first, creating the songs, the basic lyrics and structures of the songs, and then going through the recording process and turning them into the brilliant songs that they became eventually. They're constantly, getting feedback from each other, injecting each other's words and lyrics into a song. Sometimes Paul comes up with some song lyrics and then John comes up with another section. Maybe it's the middle section or vice versa. Sometimes John finishes a verse that Paul has been writing or vice versa. And as they're doing this, as they're coming up with their songs, often on, playing guitar, it all started out with them as teen boys just sitting in a room, maybe it was the bathroom or the living room or the porch of their respective homes, and just hammering out a song together. They're looking in their eyes. They're looking in each other's eyes throughout that process. They're smiling. They're laughing, finishing each other's sentences. So it's a real kind of intimate, loving relationship that they develop as songwriters. Whether this is unique in the history of songwriting, I can't say. Probably quite different from the process of a lot of other songwriting duos, because, you know, in many cases, one person is responsible for the lyrics, they write the lyrics, and then another person turns them into music. So it's a little bit more of a separated process. But in the case of John and Paul, what made them so special was that they were each contributing to the whole process: the lyrics, the melodies, the singing, the playing of the instruments. So it was a very intimate and involved collaborative process. Now, this isn't the only book on the collaboration of the Beatles. There's another one in my collection. Let me just pull out another book from my shelf. This is another excellent book, Help, by my colleague at Duke University, Thomas Brothers. Wonderful book, The Beatles, Duke Ellington, and the Magic of Collaboration. I learned so much through this book. Love to read it again. So, we have, I have a bunch of Beatles books in my personal library, and there are a lot of details, a lot of technical details about how they collaborated together to make the songs. Obviously, it's not only about John and Paul. Again, George was always there with guitar riffs, with solos, Ringo keeping the beat, although often at Paul's direction. Paul was also, and still is, a drummer, multi-talented instrumentalist. But I think it's safe to say that, the majority of songs, and certainly the most important ones in the Beatles canon, were crafted together by John and Paul as the primary songwriters. You can say later on that, some of George's songs become part of that canon. Well, My Guitar Gently Weeps, Something, and Here Comes the Sun come to mind as songs that are among the best that the Beatles wrote. And those were all written by George primarily. But most of the great Beatles songs are John and Paul hashing them out together. So I don't need to go into the details of their story or of the individual songs. Maybe just reading out the titles of the chapters gives you a sense of what this author thinks are their most important or significant or telling songs that help to understand the relationship. I'll just read out each song chapter by chapter. Come Go With Me, I Lost My Little Girl, What I Say, Will You Love Me Tomorrow, Bésame Mucho, Till There Was You. So those first 6 chapters, all those songs are songs that were written by other songwriters that the Beatles covered early on in their development as a band. Starting in chapter 7, they get to the song, he starts to focus on songs that the Beatles themselves wrote. Please Please Me, She Loves You, If I Fell, I Don't Want to Spoil the Party, Ticket to Ride, Yesterday, We Can Work It Out, In My Life, Tomorrow Never Knows, Eleanor Rigby, Here, There, and Everywhere, Strawberry Fields Forever, Penny Lane, A Day in the Life, Getting Better, I Am the Walrus, Lady Madonna, Your Blues, Look at Me, Hey Jude, Julia, Martha My Dear, Get Back, Two of Us, Don't Let Me Down, The Ballad of John and Yoko, Oh Darling, The End. So those are Beatles songs. And then chapter 35, God. That's a John Lennon song. How Do You Sleep? Another Lennon's post-Beatles song. Dear Friend, Jealous Sky. Let Me Roll It, a Paul song. I Saw Her Standing There, going back to the early Beatles. Coming Up, Just Like Starting Over, and Here Today. Just want to, say something about Here Today. it was only recently that I learned that that song was written by Paul after the death of John. I can't say that I followed very closely Paul's post-Beatles career, although I knew all his big hit songs, but I'd been aware of that song, and I remember once hearing it, and it brought me to tears because you can just hear Paul crying in the song. I knew that it was something very sad, but it was only kind of more recently that I realized, listening to the song and playing it myself, that it was written about John after his death. Very beautiful song, very beautiful testament to Paul's love for his partner, John. So, listening to the names of all these songs that make up chapters in the book, you can, some of these are, I would say, core canon Beatles songs that everybody knows and loves. Others are a little bit more deep cuts. For example, I Don't Want to Spoil the Party. I love that song, but it's not a song that typical, Beatles fan might be familiar with, who hasn't listened to their entire catalog umpteen times like I have. But others are definitely up there in the top of the heap of what the Beatles wrote. If they wrote roughly 200 songs, for this channel, I covered, I think, 185 or more of their songs. I think they wrote close to 200 songs together. And some of these would definitely be in the top 20 of the best of what they wrote about. And each one is connected in a way to the story of the relationship of Paul and John. So I think that's the insight you get from reading the book. So again, this is there's no great revelations in terms of what happened to the Beatles. You just get a deeper understanding and insight into how the songs relate to how Paul and John perceived each other, how they worked together, collaborated as artists, but also the love that they had for each other. And again, to go back to the quote that I read out earlier, it wasn't necessarily, certainly wasn't a sexual relationship in the sense of the two of them. They had sex with a lot of other partners, temporary or otherwise, probably many in front of each other over the years when they were a touring band or playing in Hamburg and such. So they were kind of intimate in the sense of they knew each other's sexual lives, as probably happens with a lot of band members, that kind of intimacy of going on the road with the band. But it was a deep understanding, I think, is the way to see it, and a kind of brotherly relationship. They called each other brothers at times. I know John called Paul his brother. They also had the bond of being not orphaned, but having lost their mothers at a young age. Paul was much younger, but John was still, I think, a late teenager when his mother was tragically hit by a car. Oh, and if you haven't seen it, I'll just throw in a movie recommendation and see the film Nowhere Boy. I think it's a brilliant film. Maybe I'll do another little podcast about that. But that's also focused on the story of John as a teenager and how he connected with his mother, but then lost her tragically. But he always had his Aunt Mimi to take care of him. But the two of them were connected in the sense that they had lost their mothers at a young age. They had different relationships with their fathers. John didn't have any blood brothers. He had a sister, which he only found out about later, I believe. maybe it was a half sister, but he didn't have any brothers. I think he grew up basically as an only child, mostly taken care of by his Aunt Mimi, whereas Paul did have brothers. Paul had a very loving family, but tragically lost his mother, I think, to cancer at a young age. So there was that bond between them, but then all the experiences that they had growing together as a band, performing in Hamburg, lots of good anecdotes about their time in Hamburg in this book, coming back, playing at the Cavern Club in Liverpool, developing their reputation, and then becoming global stars almost overnight in the around 63, 64, going to America. So, again, we don't want to diminish the role that George and Ringo played in the band. They were obviously essential to the sound of the band, and they were a big part of the songwriting process. But the primary engine was the relationship between John and Paul. I think there's no doubt about that. And this book just consolidates that understanding, while also saying that was not just the creative process, but it was the driving emotional force behind their songwriting, was the love that they had for each other. So given all of these intimate connections that they had growing up as teenagers and then in their 20s when they became global stars and traveled around the world and had all these incredible adventures, made films together and had enormous concerts and then became recording artists, went to India. All those stories are in here. It's not surprising that when it all came crashing down at the end of the 1960s, both of them were devastated by the breakup, right? And there was a lot of acrimony, a lot of pain back and forth. And at the same time, they met their new partners. So John fell in love with Yoko, even though he's already married. He divorced his first wife and ended up marrying Yoko, and who became a collaborative partner to John, and a kind of a domineering force in his life. And then Paul, of course, met Linda pretty soon after John met Yoko. Paul met Linda and eventually married her. And so they had new partners that they could collaborate with. Linda became part of Paul's band, part of the Wings, part of their sound. Yoko contributed songs to John's albums, or they made albums together, and they did events, and that's all pretty well known. But throughout that whole process, there was a lot of acrimony back and forth between Paul and John, a lot of blaming each other for things, especially the economic difficulties of breaking up as a band. And yet there were consistent attempts by both men to reach out to each other, to try to at least get beyond the acrimony, maybe reestablish a friendship. And that happened throughout the 1970s. But mostly they just watched each other from afar. John marveled and was, you could say, jealous at Paul's career as a post-Beatles singer-songwriter, performing artist, the success he had with his Wings albums, especially Band on the Run, and with his big hit songs. John had a few as well, but he had a long dry spell where he was taking care of his son, Sean. And it wasn't until the end of the 70s that he came out with his wonderful album, Double Fantasy. At least part of the album is wonderful. I like John's songs on that album and remember them well when they came out. And then when he died, they got a lot of airplay. But there's something tragic at the end of the story because John and Paul never really truly reconciled with each other. There was still a lot of unresolved tensions, a lot of kind of acrimony. They both made efforts to reach out to the other, but they just couldn't get back to where they once belonged, to quote one of their songs. as much as they tried, they just couldn't. They couldn't restore the broken friendship and partnership. They couldn't. They had to go on with their lives. I mean, that's what gave them the creative powers to continue to do good work as solo artists. They continued to be rivals in a way. They wrote songs about each other. Some are notoriously, cruel, like John's "How Do You Sleep at Night," written to Paul. And so, yeah, you could also say that, especially in John's cases, there were a lot of unresolved childhood. There was a lot of unresolved childhood trauma that he was working out in the 1970s, and he was never quite able to deal with. So, in that sense, it's a sad story, but I think it also, in a way, resolves itself after John's death, with Paul just coming to terms with how much he loved his friend and how devastating his loss was for him and for everybody. So to this day, Paul continues to celebrate John in concerts. He also, he also resurrected the song that John had written, Now and Then, and with the help of Ringo and with the help of some AI and a little posthumous George action there, he put it together into a beautiful song and a beautiful tribute to their friendship and their relationship. So it's a story that continues to bear fruit. It's still very much in a sense, as long as Paul is alive, their relationship is still very much alive and creating good work. So that's all I'm going to say about this book. I can't recommend it highly enough. I think anybody, no matter how much you think you know about the Beatles, you're going to get a lot out of reading this book. You're going to get some deep insights into their songwriting and into some of the deeper meanings behind their songs, behind some of their best songs. So that's all I have to say. Would love to hear your comments.